Perfect.
Yes. Council members, so you've heard already the way the process works is that the draft EIR goes out. It's a draft because it's available for public comment. In this case, we've had 2 public comment periods, a long period of time. As I said, we've received, I guess, more than 4,300 comments. And the comments...
From a total, some commenters of roughly 250 groups and individuals, if memory serves.
That you may be correct. Yeah. I don't remember that. It was more, I remember, yes, it was more than 100. The comments that come in during the comment period test the analysis in the EIR. That's their function. And what we've learned, for the most part, is that the analysis in the EIR is accurate. In addition, the value that comes from responding to those comments is that, and in preparing these written responses, is that we add, clarifying, amplifying discussion to the EIR that makes the EIR better as an informational document. And those responses will appear in the final EIR. While this 4,300 comments is a large number, in fact, they contain many common and recurring themes, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. These comments are from the public and stakeholders, and they allow the staff to focus on areas of particular concern. As Jim has stated, there will be responses to every individual comment that was prepared. That's a comment on the EIR or the analysis of the EIR. And in addition...
But there'll be standard answers for the ones that are the same kinds of comments, right?
That is correct. We're preparing master responses. We have 5 of them, and they will address these common themes. And sometimes the individual response will just say, see master response 2. Often it says that, and then it has a little extra discussion to hone in on the concern in that particular comment. So these comments are being prepared. They'll be published in the final EIR. Some of the common themes, which I will run through and are reflected for the most part in these master responses, are, first, probably the number one most frequent comment was why this EIR didn't analyze BDCP and the BDCP alternatives. I'll explain why it doesn't, because it's not part of this project. But in fact, there's an entire chapter devoted to BDCP in this EIR, even though BDC isn't part of the project. That chapter, in addition to describing the status of BDCP and the range of options on the table at that time, also explains in great detail that BDCP is not the Delta Stewardship Council's project. As the Delta Reform Act makes clear, it's a project delegated to another agency. That agency is doing an EIR that's in progress, hasn't been released yet. I think it's scheduled to be released this summer, later this summer. But because it's a reasonably foreseeable future project that may cause impacts that are related to the impacts of the Delta Plan, CEQA requires that it be analyzed as what's called a cumulative project. So in the cumulative impacts section of the EIR, BDCP and other ongoing things in the same environment as the Delta Plan are analyzed, and their cumulative impacts are disclosed. A second common theme is about mitigation measures, and this is directly in line with the "you didn't say enough, you said too much" theme of the comments. Some commenters thought that the mitigation measures were too vague, and in response to these comments, staff has improved the mitigation measures. So in attachment 3 to this agenda item, you'll see in track changes the proposed changes, which in many cases add more detail to the descriptions, flesh out best management practices. Certain agencies said, we have this regulatory program you have to be aware of. The vector control agencies, for instance, said, please coordinate with us. Don't leave standing water on construction sites. So those have been improved, and those were great and helpful comments. Some commenters thought that the mitigation measures usurp local authority, and this is what Jim just discussed. And as he explained, policy GP1 in the Delta Plan allows agencies to substitute their mitigation measures when they do their site-specific environmental review, as long as they're equally more effective, for projects that require that particular kind of mitigation. That process will be fleshed out, and it will be part of the process of demonstrating consistency with the Delta Plan, how the mitigation measures that are adopted and incorporated into the Delta Plan are either incorporated into these projects or why they aren't, and what the alternatives are.
And just if I can, on that point, something I forgot to mention is the incorporation of the EIR's mitigation measures from this project into the Delta Plan itself is a legal requirement of CEQA, of the statute itself. That's why we did it.
That's correct.
But it built in the flexibility that we've all talked about.
Yes, for private development projects, they're made conditions of approval, but for public projects, they're required to be adopted and incorporated into the project. Some commenters commented that the level of detail in the EIR is not adequate, and Jim has covered that pretty extensively. It's a planning document that establishes water reliability, ecosystem restoration, water quality, flood risk reduction, and delta protection policies and recommendations that affect large areas of the state. Accordingly, the CEQA guidelines recommend that the degree of specificity of the EIR should correspond to the degree of specificity of the underlying project. That's why this is a program-level EIR. The environmental impacts that are analyzed are the impacts that could occur from these types of projects in these 5 categories that are encouraged by the Delta Plan. These aren't direct impacts of the Delta Plan, they're indirect impacts, but again, CEQA requires EIRs to analyze indirect as well as direct impacts, and that's why this is a program-level document. As these projects, which are covered actions, are proposed and there are specific sites for them identified, lead agencies for those projects will prepare environmental review that looks at the site-specific impacts of those projects. Another theme, a common theme in the comments is that a specific alternative submitted by a specific commenter wasn't included in the range of alternatives, or that the EIR alternatives are different from what stakeholders proposed for the types, and there were the types described by Dan. The CEQA legal requirement is that a range of reasonable alternatives, or a reasonable range of alternatives, depending on which section of CEQA you look at, is analyzed. And that task of deciding what the range is up to the staff preparing the EIR. There was an extensive outreach project to the public and stakeholders on this very issue of alternatives, which you can review in Section 2A of the draft EIR volume. It's 2.3.1.4 if you want to look at it. And the resulting comments from hundreds of commenters were these alternatives that were described, which bracket the range.
I distinctly recall this discussion 2 years ago when interest groups came in and said, here's my alternative, which you have to analyze in precise detail. And we said, we'll include some of these things in the options covered, but everybody comes back, you didn't include it the way we wanted to do. And they also imply, if not say, you're legally obligated to study anything we suggest you have to study. Are we?
No. The legal requirement, there's a large body of law on this subject. The legal requirement is a reasonable range. Often there are other ways of looking at things. There are other variations on the alternatives, and the courts have been consistently clear that that's not the test, and that every single alternative proposed needn't be analyzed. There's another section in the EIR, or maybe it's a subsection of this, that explains alternatives that were suggested and rejected for further analysis. So that's a helpful discussion as well. There were many comments about the impacts of more natural flows in the Delta, and whether they would have impacts, especially upstream of the Delta. The EIR does analyze this issue. First of all, it's important to know that the more natural flow regime will be implemented by actions of another agency, not the Delta Stewardship Council. The Delta Reform Act assigns that task to the State Water Resources Control Board. The State Water Resources Control Board will be adopting flow objectives, which have been described as more natural. They will have impacts on water supply, fish and wildlife recreation, and other resource areas, but those impacts are predicted to be limited by existing legal protections and by some EIR mitigation measures that address some of these likely impacts. So there should not be significant impacts, or if they are mitigated to the degree feasible. Other people have commented, other commenters, that the more natural flow regime, and in particular policy WRP1, will reduce water supply. The EIR thoroughly analyzed this issue as well, and there's an underlying misperception about what a more natural flow regime means in terms of water supply. And in fact, the main difference isn't, it is our understanding that the main difference is not that there will be less water supply overall available to Delta water users, but that the timing of the water supply availability may be changed under these future, more natural flow regime implemented through the State Water Resources Control Board's flow objectives. The final EIR will explain this in more detail because there were many comments on this issue. It will explain that the more natural flow regime will, and this was actually this is also in the draft EIR, could reduce supplies somewhat and result in long-term fallowing of some agricultural lands. That's analyzed in, I believe, Section 7, the Agricultural Resources section. That existing water rights would not be affected by the flow objectives without a major public process in which the State Water Resources Control Board will be balancing beneficial uses, taking into account local needs. That would be coming up in the future, and we don't know the outcome of that. Delta Plan Policy WRP1 will not affect any supplier that has met existing water planning requirements, begun implementation of feasible local and regional water supply project, and has established expected outcomes or performance measures for measuring reduction of reliance on Delta water. And finally, that more local and regional water supplies, increased efficiency, and adjusted operation of the water systems will compensate for any potential loss or change timing of availability of Delta water. That will be explained, again, in more detail in the final EIR. The last common theme, which I think was pretty thoroughly covered, and I don't need to cover it again, is about the ability of the project and the alternatives to meet the project objectives. I just want to add from a legal standpoint that analysis isn't actually required to be in the EIR. It will be in the CEQA findings, and it will be in the section concerning the evaluation of the other alternatives that are not proposed for adoption and why they would be rejected. That's in one of the attachments, attachment 2, to the agenda item. And that is my presentation on the comments.
Just very briefly then, to conclude our staff presentation, then I want to turn it over to the council for questions, because we've been talking a lot, and we certainly want to be able to respond to things that you might be wondering about. But what are the next steps then as we go ahead with this process? Over the coming couple of weeks, we'll be finalizing the responses to the comments we've received into a 4th volume, so that the final EIR that will be available will be 3 volumes already prepared, and a 4th volume that includes any changes to the EIR that result from our analysis of the comments, and any changes you might make today in the project, as well as responding to comments. And all those will be posted no less than 10 days before the May hearing. There's not a comment period required on the final EIR. Instead, what we'll be doing in May is bringing it to you to certify, verifying that you've reviewed the information and considered it as you're making your decision, that it reflects our agency's independent judgment and analysis, and that it's in compliance with CEQA. And then after you've certified it, we'll have to prepare findings about how you're using it as you act on the Delta plan, that you've considered the impacts, that you've adopted mitigation measures, that where mitigation isn't proposed, it's because it's not feasible, or there's some overriding consideration that leading you to approve the project despite adverse impacts. So that would include our recommendation, but our presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
All right, let's go around. Mr. Natoli, I think you had some follow-up questions.
I guess my question, first I want to express my thanks to all the folks that have worked and labored so very hard to, I think, put together the information that's been covered in, I would somewhat be a brief summary, even though it may have taken a while here. I think it reflects, obviously, the volumes of information that have been generated, the responses to that information, and the ongoing work that obviously will tee it up for deliberations and decision by this council. So again, I wanted to say my thanks and say that to all of you here this morning, but there's been a lot of folks I know that have devoted a very serious amount of time to making sure their preparations for today, but also over the past many months. So my thanks. I wanted to maybe, if we could, just go to some of the mitigation measure chapters and I had a couple.
Members, this is attachment number 3 to
Yes.
item 6A, and it is I think it's 19 legally required elements of mitigation analysis. I think that's right.
Right.
I counted.
I want to just hone in a couple questions on particular chapters of that. And this may tie to some discussion we have later, so we can certainly defer on this.
If you have a specific question
Yeah.
on a page, will you let
Yeah,
us
I'm going to get to it.
know?
Yeah,
Okay.
section 5, Delta flood risk. And I guess my general question there is that when we look at under the regulations that we're going to
Page
talk about.
7?
Yes, page 7 is a chapter. It's more of a general question that relates to this chapter, but on pages 8 and 9, we talk about looking at the effects of impacts of reducing flood risk and some of the efforts can be taken. What I wanted to ask, maybe of Dan, is when we get into the regulation discussion, part of our conversation over many months is, in those areas that might be flood prone, that this 200-year levee standard, the application of that, and now a suggestion by staff, which you haven't yet presented, that we utilize sea level rise in a flood-proofing approach. My question for this mitigation measure, what agency is the one that's utilizing that for application, though? Because we rely on FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Water Resources, Central Valley Flood Protection Planning, and yet as we get into regulations later today, we're going to be talking about a recommendation for our consideration that rather in those areas where the 200-year is infeasible or impractical, that maybe use a different approach.
Yeah, the members, Mr. Natoli is referring to the regulatory policy RR, risk reduction P2,
Yes.
appearing on page 12 of the matrix that's coming up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I don't want to get a sidetracked here, but because this talks about mitigations for reduction of risk and relies upon certain entities and their information now and going forward. So what entity, I guess for my question purposes, what entity is it that's now applying that more universally? I mean, there are folks that are doing it, as mentioned in the legislation. So if we're going to use that as mitigation versus a more typical approach, which is levies and or other measures that are called out for here, I guess, when doing those hydraulic studies. So where does sea level rise enter into that equation relative to the mitigation?
Yeah, in reviewing the mitigation measures, I don't see here a reference to the flood proofing of structures. The plan, these measures are designed to respond to the impacts of the plan. Okay. So since the plan already includes policies today that would require that the structures that are in rural parts of the Delta have a 200-year flood protection, either through levees or flood proofing. There's no related provision in the mitigation measures that requires that, because that's a basic requirement of the plan. Again, what the mitigation measures are trying to get at is, hey, what are the adverse impacts of the plan that aren't covered by the policies? And so I think we'll be getting to your question later when we get to the discussion of the regulations, but there's nothing in the mitigation measures that I would see that references that.
Yeah, it's actually in a different section.
Okay,
It's in the climate change section.
okay. Call us to
Excuse
page.
me. It's mitigation measure 21-4. I think it's the very last page. 21-3 and 21-4.
Page 69.
Actually, there's several of them. So 68 and 69. I'm actually not sure why it ended up there, but
Okay, and that helps. And so maybe I can take a look at this section and read through it, maybe, and come back to that then. So I appreciate that.
By the way, I think this question is an interesting illustration that the EIR itself is not where the policy questions are raised, but it's related. The discussions are related. The subjects touch one another. And I think Mr. Natoli picked a terrific example to illustrate how these various documents work with each other.
Okay. Well, and I will look at this section closer, the one you just referenced, mitigation measures 21.3, 21.4, and then maybe come back to a question a little later on in today's conversation. All right. If I could just move forward then to the section 7 in the mitigation measures, page
15.
Page 15. And if someone could just take a moment, in this section, it probably has more color to it than some of the others, related to the various changes that have been made and words added, elimination, and particularly on that first page, page 15, I guess the last bullet point there, where it talked about some of the approaches that would be taken if there was loss of agricultural land. And I know some of that was certainly touched upon, and the reason I drew some attention to it was that when the Delta Protection Commission did its economic sustainability plan, there was certainly a lot of focus on productive agriculture and its contribution to the economy and so forth. And I know some of these things were talked about related to some of the hearings we conducted and heard from folks about the concerns about loss of agricultural land, but then introduction of certain species and the impacts upon their operations long term. So I don't know, Dan or James or somebody could take just a little time and maybe further explanation as to what's transpired here and what you're currently recommending as far as the mitigation measures and the structures.
Well, let me start, and then we'll see if our colleagues want to join in. The revisions that were proposed, the mitigation measures you see are those that were part of the draft EIR dating back to the initial plan that was analyzed in the EIR. So that was done initially prior to the Delta Protection Commission weighing in. Your economic sustainability plan, as you'll recall, came after the EIR was released on the proposed project, the draft that had been prepared in the fall of 2011. So the recommendations from the Protection Commission that were incorporated in the plan, require the protection of farmlands from urban development so that they'll be available for agriculture, and require that water management facilities and ecosystem restoration projects avoid or mitigate impacts to farmlands to the extent that it's feasible, and that they consult with local governments to make sure that part of that process. And it directs the folks to consider measures like buffer areas that would help reduce impacts in adjacent farmlands. So those generally reflect similarly the requirements that are here. Obviously, as people conduct projects, they have to consider alternatives, so that would give them the chance to examine whether there's a chance to avoid it. We talk about buffer areas as one of the kinds of mitigation measures that might be required, and we've got other examples here in terms of managing operations to reduce invasive weeds, to redesign projects, to minimize fragmenting or isolating farmlands into ways that they would be too small to be useful. What we've not done is establish a requirement that in every case conversions of farmland be compensated for by easements in a one-to-one ratio. Instead, we're saying that, hey, it depends on the project. There ought to be a target of one-to-one for permanent conversions. Other kinds of projects, folks generally have more flexible approaches, both in state and local governments, to evaluate the impacts and see how severe they are and whether they actually warrant treatment under CEQA.
Dan, on that last bullet on page 15, though, and I don't know when that came out, what the purple denotes there, but was that taken out more recently, or was that because it actually was more expansive, at least in the way that it I don't know if it defined, but certainly talked about the approaches as related to impacts to adjacent agricultural lands and so forth, but that's now been stricken, and yet we still make a finding of significant impact as we conclude that on the next page. And so you touched on it a moment ago when you were explaining, but so basically you just kind of simplify, you leave it very general. Maybe that's the way.
Yeah, I think as it comes to easements and financial compensation, those are not mitigation measures that address the environmental effects of projects. Those are mitigation measures that address the socioeconomic impacts of projects. And so that might be a way that the local agency or another partner would want to verify that they're going to conduct a mitigation measure, but they aren't necessarily actually a measure that it would be necessary to avoid the impact or reduce it.
Okay,
And then
so,
in terms of the
so why was
environmental
it, so it was
impact,
taken out because of that reason?
that would be my impression, yeah, and I was involved in the discussions about this.
Mr. Andrew.
Dan, I think, summarized it in his last statement here very well. CEQA protects the physical conversion of agricultural land. It does not protect the sort of reduction, and this isn't a statement of policy or value judgment. It just is what it is. It's in the CEQA guidelines. It protects the physical conversion of agricultural land, and CEQA is very clear that it doesn't cover social or economic effects of anything, agricultural land or any other type of social economic effect. So, it protects agricultural land from, paving it over, but the reduction in its value is a socioeconomic effect that it doesn't cover. So I think that the short answer is this measure was in the original EIR and recognized in going through the process that it was not an actual CEQA mitigation. It was a socioeconomic mitigation. And then with respect to the first bullet point, I think we realized through public comment, and Ellen sort of touched on that in terms of some comments about the specificity of mitigation measures. The second bullet point was revised to provide a little more flexibility by calling it a target of 1-to-1 ratio, depending on the nature of the conversion, the nature of the farmland itself, to allow local agencies with more flexibility. And there is no standard in the law for what the appropriate ratio should be. Some counties have none. I think City of Davis is the only one I'm aware of, has a 2-to-1. So there is no standard in law, and so rather than be very prescriptive, we made it a target 1-to-1 to allow local agencies to have more flexibility.
Okay. And if I could, just one more question on this section then. So the finding is still that under certain circumstances, the impacts of the conversion would be significant. So we still have a finding of significance. And is there, as it ties back to other activities that are described in the Delta Plan, is there any way that you could get to less than significant on this particular?
I think when we, I'd have to refer, maybe Cindy might be able to get the Ag chapter up to the EIR to tell me if I'm wrong. But, I think when we look at the impacts of the plan as proposed, one, the reduction of supplies that water supplies that might be available to agriculture as a result of a more natural flow regime. We can just look at the substitute environmental document that the Water Board released on their San Joaquin flow studies, and it tracks with what we've said in the EIR, that there's a risk that, thousands of acres of farmland may be without water supplies that will be adequate to keep them in production as we know it today. And we can mitigate that with developing other supplies and recycling to some extent, but there will be impacts there. In addition, if the impacts of the 8 to 10,000 acres, if I remember the numbers right, of restoration that are required under biological opinions, which are the target of the Delta Plan as it's before you now, agricultural lands would be taken out of production as well. Those impacts may or may not be significant. I think it probably depends on how the restoration is evaluated in the site-specific scale. Usually the way agencies look at impacts to farmland is if the land is still available to grow a product, whether it's growing cottonwood trees or, peach trees, many agencies would conclude that there's no damage to the agricultural resource, which is the soil that's capable of producing either of those things. But if you should bury that property under a slab of pavement, perhaps, or maybe use it as a stockpile for levee maintenance materials, so it can never be farmed again. You're going to bury it under a pile of rocks or something. In those cases, that impact would require some compensation, unless the agency decided, no, there's countervailing benefits as well. So that kind of evaluation is going to need to go on. If you're putting in a reservoir that provides an agricultural water supply, but in the process you're flooding a cattle ranch, is that an adverse impact on agriculture? So I think, folks need to judge those things on a case-by-case basis. But I
Mr.
think
Andrew wanted to weigh in too. I think.
When we look at the overall pattern, I think you can see that there probably are adverse impacts to agricultural resources, some kinds of agricultural resources that are unavoidable and would be significant, but they aren't so significant of some of those that are proposed in other alternatives. Again, remember, the alternative that was advocated by the environmental groups was going to take hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland out of production. And so we've been unable to avoid any impact, but we've done our best to, produce a program that we think is as compatible with agriculture as it can be, and in many ways, it's encouraging agriculture through some of the actions we're taking in the Delta's Place chapter of the plan.
Mr. Andrew, no?
Okay, I appreciate that explanation. Just to drill down to this just a little further then on, and I would just go to the next section 8 on the visual resources, page 19. And this probably would apply for other chapters, but as I understand, these are mitigation measures that were applied to covered actions, correct?
That's correct.
And kind of going back to questions I asked just a moment ago, but then this gets in, these mitigation measures, for example, get into some very detailed applications of things, again, that I would think would be more at the local level or I guess a state agency. And again, but I mean, the level of detail here relative to things you would do, I'm not going to go through in all the bullets here, but as I noted this, I thought, we keep things more general and say, well, you'll take it at the time of it, but time we look at whatever project is proposed or covered action. Here, though, and maybe it's just because, these are commonly applied mitigations. So maybe give me some sense of that. Sometimes you're more general. You make some general comments about how you would approach it. Here, though, this gets down to, the types of plantings, the types of colors, the types of edges on certain mounds. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Understanding those are ways to mitigate for, but the level of detail here is so great, and yet on things that could have them, I think, at least as a greater impact, if not greater in some cases, we leave it nebulous.
Yeah, I think, when you, in any process, you've got folks who are contributing to it that are lumpers or splitters, and some people like to have a broad general principle. And
lumpers and splitters?
Yeah. It's the biology side of me coming out. But some people would rather see a broad principle and leave it to a subsequent process to provide the detail. I would suspect that, landscape architects looking at these, they're going through their menu of choices. Many of these wouldn't apply to a typical kind of project that I would imagine in the Delta, which has a landscape in which some of these activities probably would actually interfere with how we think of the Delta landscape being today, open and agricultural and with wide vistas. And, I'm not sure I want people, I think one of these talks about using walls and, climbing plants and other things to mask structures. I think in the Delta, we're used to looking at things and maybe you got a little windbreak or something. So I think, again, that's the flexibility that's available to the approving entity, looking at the situation that's there before them, what are the facts, selecting through this manual or other things that might be equally effective. And I think that's the key thing here, that flexibility is provided to the approving agency.
Okay, so this serves as a menu or a guide, but when it's a regulation and a mitigation measure that there has to be some findings made for those that, say you have an agency that has a covered action, they've got to go through this pretty thoroughly, I assume, and look at all these various aspects. But then these are more than just menu things to pick off of. Is that, or am I incorrect?
Let me, if I can jump in here, and I think to jump off of something that Dan just said, and it's the definition of feasible. The definition of feasible under CEQA is pretty flexible, and it involves policy of the local agency that will be actually applying these. And if local agency has general plan policies or other policies, they don't have to be that specific, then the agency can find that the particular mitigation is infeasible. Feasible means capable of being accomplished in a successful manner within a reasonable time, taking into account economic, environmental, legal, social, and technological factors. And social involves policy factors. So there's a lot of flexibility built into CEQA itself on feasibility, which is then built in through General Plan Policy 1. So there is a lot of flexibility, and they are, I'm not sure menu is the right word. It's generally, we call them in CEQA speak at the program level, oftentimes we refer to them as mitigation strategies. So it is true that for a covered action coming from the consistency process, they will have to explain which of the mitigation measures they adopted from the EIR and which ones they didn't and which ones they substituted. We're not envisioning that that's going to be a bullet-by-bullet recitation. And I think to your other question about, I'm not sure lumpers or splitters the right one, but the general versus the general versus the specific, I think part of it reflects the common accepted practice depending on the impact. You know, these types of measures here, while they're pretty specific, are also pretty common, pretty accepted. Some of them, as Dan, I think, very articulately mentioned, you know, apply in an urban setting where you do want to have a wastewater treatment plant shielded from the view of the kids at the neighboring. Hopefully, there's not a daycare center next by, but a park. You know, maybe there's some sports facility. I don't know. But in the Delta, it's a different story. So there'll be flexibility built in. You know, I think with respect to mitigation for agricultural land, while a very important and very sensitive topic, it's one that's in California law over the past 10 years, 15 years has really evolved, and there really is no common practice. There's a couple of cases out there that say, the only really published cases on this say that preserving ag land that you're not touching with your project with easements isn't really mitigation because you're not creating new farmland. You are just preserving other farmland, and say that that's not actual mitigation, that it's not even required. And then you have, you know, other agencies who go the other way, and there's no standard on this. And so to have a really specific list of mitigation measures that we would then say apply to every covered action, that's very prescriptive to everybody across the state when there's absolutely no accepted, generally acknowledged real approach to mitigating for agricultural land, other than some of the, you know, things that I think we've done here through buffer areas and a target mitigation ratio. To be really prescriptive about something where there is no generally accepted, I think would have been we would have been, I think, justifiably accused of overstepping. On these, where it's pretty accepted, pretty standard type of stuff, it made more sense to be more specific. Again, but as we said before, there's a lot of flexibility built in with GP1.
The explanations are helpful. I appreciate it. But Mr. Chair, that's enough for right now, and I'll take a look at the climate action section, and we'll may have some questions later on. Thanks.
Okay, good. That was actually quite interesting. Come back and do that again the next time. No, it actually was. It was a helpful way to get into the discussion. Mr. Andrews?
Yeah, and, you know, this is helpful for us. You know, the public comment we get pushes our envelope, and that's what it's designed to do. So we welcome this.
I can't resist it. The last time I actually futzed around with an environmental impact report and these mitigation conditions was years ago when I was on the city council. And all I can remember is we made some poor developer under one of our mitigation conditions contribute money to the public cable television access program in Sacramento under what plausible argument I do not remember.
They may have tightened the rules in the succeeding years.
That's why they're arguing for CEQA reform now, isn't it? They're using that as an example.
Okay.